Hey y'all, it's Robert, and in today's video, I'm going to be making a cake of Stitch, the character from Lilo and Stitch.
Ow.
And Stitch is one of the most requested characters I've been asked to do, so of course I had to give it a try because I do love making character cakes, but they are pretty difficult to do because there's a clear reference point of what I'm trying to make, and if I don't make it look just right, it's gonna look more like Glitch than Stitch, and I don't want that to happen. So the first step is to level and tort all the cake layers. And for this, I'm using vanilla confetti cake. And I have different sizes. I have 10-inch, 8-inch, and 6-inch cakes. And then once all of those are torted, I'm then going to add simple syrup to them because I am going to carve this cake. So I don't want it to dry out as I'm working on it. Before I start stacking the cake, I want to make sure that I'm building it on a solid foundation because I don't want this cake to fall over as I'm working on it. So I'm going to be using a threaded rod and I'm attaching that to the cake board. And then to make sure that this is all food safe, I'm going to be covering that with aluminum tape. Now I can start stacking this cake, and I'm using vanilla buttercream when I'm doing this. And I'm starting with the 10-inch cakes first, then going to the 8-inch and then the 6-inch. The cake is all stacked, so I can now start carving it. And the entire time I'm doing this, I'm looking at a picture of Stitch, trying to make sure that I get the proportions just right, because I am going to be building on this later with ganache and modeling chocolate, but I need to make sure that I have a really good foundation to work on. Now that I have the cake carved, I'm adding a crumb coat to it because I didn't make a lot of crumbs whenever I was carving it, and I want to make sure that none of those actually end up in the final coat. Now it's time to cover the cake with chocolate ganache, but first I have to make it, and I'm using a 3-to-1 ratio for this, meaning that there's 3 times the amount of chocolate compared to the cream, and I'm going to combine this until it's smooth and then allow it to rest just for a few before I add it to the cake. I'm adding the ganache to the cake with a piping bag, and I'm adding a thin layer and then smoothing this out with an acetate sheet. And I'm using this instead of a spatula because of the shape of the cake, and I'm really trying to make sure that I get all the curves. While the ganache is setting, I'm preparing the modeling chocolate because I'm going to completely cover this cake with it. But before I add it, I'm going to make sure that I steam this cake because I need to make sure that the modeling chocolate actually sticks to it. Because of the size of this cake, I'm adding the modeling chocolate in 2 pieces just to make sure that I get it completely covered. So I'm adding the front half first, getting that as smooth as I can, and then I'm adding the second half. Now that this cake is covered in modeling chocolate, I now have a really good base, so I can now start designing this. And I'm gonna start off by making the feet and the hands first. Making the feet wasn't a really difficult thing for me to do, but making the hands was so difficult. I've always had a really hard time with making hands for any kind of character, so I wanted to make sure that this was one of the first things that I did, and no joke, this really took me about 2 hours just to make both of the hands. I did finally get through it, but it took so much time. Stitch's tail is actually really easy to do. It's just a ball, so I'm adding that to the back of the cake, and then I'm using modeling tools to smooth that modeling chocolate into the rest of the body. Now that the body is done, I can start working on Stitch's face. And at this point, the most that I can do is mark where his eyes and his mouth will be, because I am going to be cutting out this portion of his mouth because I want it to look like it'll be open. To make his mouth, I'm using a knife to cut out that portion that I marked earlier, and then I'm filling it in with modeling chocolate. To add a little more detail to the mouth, I'm adding a tongue, and this is just a little mound of modeling chocolate, and I'm using modeling tools to create an indentation in it. So there's just a few more things I have to do before I can add color to this cake, and that's adding the little tuft of hair on the top of his head, and then also his ears. And this is where it all went wrong. So I tried so many ways to make his ears stay on his head. And because they're so thin, but they are pretty long, it's kind of a lot of weight that's going to be pulling down on them. So I tried wooden skewers to hold them in place. That didn't work. I also tried to use a little bit of wire in the ears, and that was a big failure too. So I eventually had to change the shape of them and make them kind of stick to the sides of his head. And it kind of looks like a koala, but I really didn't have another option, and I still think it looks pretty good. So majority of this cake is now modeled, and I can now start adding color to it. And to do this, I'm using an edible paint, and I'm adding a diluter to it to get the right consistency that I need. And I'm gonna start off by painting the little portion of his body and his eyes with a light blue color. Now I'm mixing up a dark pink burgundy color to paint the inside of his ears, and then I'm painting the rest of his body with a darker blue color. I'm painting the inside of his mouth with a burgundy color and then painting his tongue pink. I have to add a little more features to his face to make it more stitch-like. So I'm using black modeling chocolate to make his eyes, and I'm just using my fingers to get that into the right shape, and then adding a little piece of white modeling chocolate to make the pupils. I have to add his nose, and I'm using black modeling chocolate for this. And at first, it was looking like a koala, but I did realize I needed to add a little more to make it look more stitch-like. To finish his face, I need to add the teeth, and to do this, I'm using white modeling chocolate, and I'm using my fingers to create the right shapes, and then I added a little piping gel so that they'd stick whenever I place them in the mouth. The last thing to do is add a dark blue color on the bottom of his feet and on his claws. I'm using the same blue color to create this pattern on the back of his body. I'm not quite sure what it's supposed to be, but I'm just looking at a picture of Stitch while I'm doing this and getting it as close as I can. So here it is. This is the Stitch cake complete. I had a lot of fun working on this cake, but I did run into a lot of obstacles that I just didn't think were going to be a big problem, like his hands and his ears, but I did manage to work it out. So if you enjoyed this cake, make sure that you like the video and subscribe to the channel if you haven't. And if you have any requests for me, make sure that you leave those in the comments below. And until then, I'll see y'all in the next video.